Okay, so I've cooled down from my last rant. Time to get on to another rant, am I right? Today I want to talk about nerd rage culture. It's a term that I've heard similar terms being used to describe what's going on right now, but I haven't heard anybody really referring to it in this particular way. So I'm just gonna use this particular phrase to describe it. I'm calling it nerd rage culture for a reason, because nerd rage has been a thing for a long time, but it is coming to a head right now, and it is getting really bad. Like, it is getting very toxic, I will put it that way. Nerd rage culture has become extremely toxic in the worst way. Like, this is not the way that geeks and nerds should be behaving about these kinds of things, and yet you're seeing it all the freaking time. So, as I was mentioning in the Out of the Shadows discussion I was having, I think that a major reason that people didn't like this movie, don't like it, don't want to go see it, is because of this whole nerd rage culture. This whole concept of, like, people thinking they deserve better. And there are a lot of contributing factors to this. In that video, I discussed a couple of contributing factors, such as the rose-colored glasses syndrome, which, it's not necessarily your fault if you are viewing the past with rose-colored glasses. Literally everyone does that. But, it's on you to actually take a step back and realize that maybe the past wasn't as pristine and beautiful as you remember it being, right? Maybe it was a little bit goofier and more ridiculous and stupid than you remember, right? One of the reasons that this happens, of course, is as a child you don't really have any responsibilities. As a child you get to do a lot more and have a lot more fun. You get summer vacation every freaking year, where you get to take 3 months off of any and all responsibilities that you would have had. I mean, being a kid was awesome. You know what I mean? It was awesome. And I understand that whole, I understand the rose-colored glasses syndrome, because you remember that about being a kid above all. You remember it being a great time. So you're prone to think, just physiologically and mentally speaking, you're prone to think that because you had so little responsibilities, and because your childhood was so good and you didn't have any responsibilities, or didn't have as many responsibilities as you do as an adult, because you're prone to thinking about that first. Anything and everything else that you remember from your childhood automatically feels like it's better than it actually might have been. So that's just something that happens. I think that's one component to the problem of nerd rage culture that we're seeing right now. But another huge component right now, I think, is it is no longer unacceptable to be a nerd. It is no longer unacceptable to be a geek. You can be a nerd, you can be a geek, you can go to Comic-Con, you can do all these things and like all these things, and it's acceptable now. And the proof is in the pudding. Most of the major movies coming out right now are like Marvel movies and stuff like that. I mean, geek culture has taken over. It is the new norm, You're not normal if you don't like these things, It's crazy. It's like a complete 180 from what it used to be when we were kids, It's completely different. So I think that's a contributing factor, because it has opened the geek and nerd culture up to a wider audience than previously would have found this acceptable, right? Previously, the audience for nerdy, geeky stuff wasn't as big, because nerdy and geeky stuff was shunned a little bit more, and it wasn't seen as something that was a positive thing in our society. Today it very much is seen as more of a positive thing, and it's seen as something that's more acceptable. So if you're found in the wild wearing a Superman shirt, of course, why not? Superman represents geek and nerd culture, and nerd culture is acceptable now. So, it's a part of what's happened. Ultimately, I think that's a positive thing. That's a positive thing that's happened with nerd and geek culture, because I personally like that it is accepted that I like the things that I do. I like that I no longer have to be shamed. I never felt ashamed, but I was shamed by people for being a geek and a nerd in the past. So it's nice to know that that doesn't happen as often anymore, you know what I mean? And on that level, I think it's a positive thing. But on the other level, because the geek and nerd culture has been opened up to so many new audiences, those audiences are likely to be more unruly. I'm not saying that the new geeks are the ones at fault per se. I'm just saying when you get a larger audience, it's harder to keep that larger audience in line. It's harder to, control in any way, shape, or form. I'm not saying that the geek or nerd audience should ever be controlled, but that the smaller geek and nerd audience, while Nerd Rage did exist back in the day, it was kind of more confined thing, you know what I mean? And now it's not confined. Now the audience is big enough that Nerd Rage can completely wipe out and obliterate an entire franchise if they try hard enough. I guess it's like a democratic system when you think about it. Vote with your dollar kind of thing, and vote with your conscience almost. But even if that is true, it's still kind of disappointing, because in a nerd culture as big as this one, you would hope that even the things that aren't necessarily going to appeal to the wider nerd audience, but will appeal to a smaller cult audience, you would hope that those things would be accepted enough that the smaller cult audience could enjoy them without fear of repercussion, or without fear that the wider audience would shun it out of existence. You know what I mean? And you see that happening with Out of the Shadows. Like, people are just shitting all over it. But you're also seeing it happening with Ghostbusters, which I do not expect to do very well. And that's sad, because they were planning on doing a whole bunch more content. They opened up an entirely new segment of the studio at Sony. They opened up an entirely new personal studio, a studio specifically designed to do nothing but Ghostbusters project. They were going to do an animated Ghostbusters movie, and from there on, who knows what they might have done. They could have done more Ghostbusters cartoons. Who freaking knows? It could have been awesome, all right? And I say it could have been, because even though the movie isn't out yet, I am almost 100% sure that the Nerd Rage culture that exists today, for the variety of reasons, some of which I have discussed already, I am very positively sure that Nerd Rage culture is going to keep that movie from being successful. And the reason is, I think it's going to be like Fanforstic was. I think it's going to be like Fantastic Four was. And granted, Fantastic Four was not a good movie. You saw my review of it, or you may have seen my review of it. I did a review of it last year after it came out. And I didn't like the movie. I felt like it was a pile of crap, right? But at the same time, I don't feel like it was the worst movie I've ever seen. I feel like it was a serviceable movie. It was okay. It just wasn't as good as it could have been. And that was a disappointment. But that still serves as an excellent example of Nerd Rage culture in the modern landscape. Because that movie got shit on before it came out and after it came out. And as a result, it failed miserably. It was a complete and utter failure on all fronts. And while they did actually decide to continue on, and they're supposedly they're going to continue on and do Fantastic Four 2, or a sequel to this movie. While that is the case, we don't know if that's going to be the case for Ghostbusters. And given how much money they've invested into like creating an entire studio devoted to Ghostbusters stuff, if they don't make enough money back from this particular movie to warrant continuing that studio and continuing on with further Ghostbusters stuff, it could be a disaster. We might not see any Ghostbusters movies for years to come. We might not see any Ghostbusters anything for years to come. And that's just really disappointing to me, because we were on the cusp of that, right? We were on the cusp of getting something really good. And the thing is, this movie could actually turn out to be really good. A lot of people are saying it looks like shit. They're saying they don't like the trailers. They don't find them funny or scary. And like, okay, if that's what your opinion is of the trailer, then fine. But you haven't seen the movie yet, and until you've seen the movie, you can't really judge it, can you? You really, really can't. Because that's like judging a book by its cover. Don't judge a book by its cover. Remember that famous fucking advice that everybody knows? Come on now. And that's something we're seeing a lot in this nerd rage culture, which we're seeing a bunch of people who are freaking out about something that is essentially the book cover. And they are willing to completely bury a movie, completely bury a particular project that millions of dollars are spent on, simply because the cover of the book that they're looking at, metaphorically speaking, doesn't look like what they wanted to see personally. And it's really sad. It's disappointing. And when I look at the things with Out of the Shadows, it kind of helps me to understand that nerd rage culture a little bit better even than Ghostbusters does. Because on that level, I can understand and see people who are upset because they didn't get a movie that represented the original comic books, which is what they wanted to see. Or I can see people who weren't happy because they liked the original movies and they wanted to see something that was more of a representation of the original movies. Or I can see somebody who didn't get a representation of the 2003 series, and that was their favorite iteration of the Ninja Turtles, so they weren't happy with it. Or I can see somebody who isn't happy with it because it wasn't an iteration of the Nickelodeon franchise of the Ninja Turtles. There are so many different versions of the Ninja Turtles that it's easier to see all these segmented little communities within this nerd rage culture who don't like it for this particular reason, because it didn't particularly meet their specific expectations, because it wasn't based on the particular version of the franchise that they prefer, right? And because it wasn't based on the version of the franchise that they specifically prefer, they're unhappy with it, and they're shitting on it, and they're throwing all kinds of crap at it, and they're just burying it before it can do anything. Even if it's a good movie, even if it's okay, they don't care, because it didn't give them exactly what they wanted. So these communities, there's a large community that likes the 2003 series and wants to see more stuff done like the 2003 series of Ninja Turtles. There is a large community that wants to see stuff done like the original comic books for Ninja Turtles. And there is a large community, I would say probably even larger than the other two, that really wants to see stuff that was more like the original movies, because they're really nostalgic for those movies right now. 90s is huge right now. And so in that particular case, when you combine all of those audiences together, they represent a pretty big faction of people who are fans of this particular nerdy or geeky franchise, right? And that's just it. There are, I think that's the same kind of thing that's going on with Ghostbusters, is that there are a lot of people who want this particular kind of Ghostbusters, or they want that particular kind of Ghostbusters, or they want that kind of Ghostbusters. And all of them combined are saying slightly different things that all sound very similar, and so they're all kind of becoming a conglomerate voice of negativity against that franchise as a result. And really, it's like a game changer when it comes to the movies, because it kind of flies in the face of the way that movies used to work, of the way that expectations for ticket sales used to work. The expectations for Out of the Shadows was that it would earn at least $50 million over the weekend, and it's looking like it won't even hit that. Probably, mostly because of the hatred from a lot of these smaller communities coming together and representing a much larger community overall. So, yeah, I can kind of understand where nerd rage culture comes from in the modern sense, but while I think it could be a positive force used for good, right now what I know, based on what I can see, is that it is not being used for good. It is being used for evil. Nerd rage culture is destroying a lot of potential things, a lot of great potential in the nerd community. And I don't know that they know that they're doing it, but if they do, then I just don't get it. Why would you want to do that when you have a chance to see more in this franchise? Why would you want to shoot yourself in the metaphorical foot and ruin those chances? I don't get it. I don't get it. So yeah, nerd rage culture. What do you think of it? I'm not a fan of how it has developed over the past decade or so. It started out good, and it has become extremely, extremely toxic in the ways that I was describing just a few minutes ago. So yeah. But yeah, I am interested to hear your thoughts on it. I want to know if you think that either Out of the Shadows or Ghostbusters are representative of nerd rage culture run amok, or if you can think of your own particular examples that you feel like are better examples. Feel free to share that with me as well. Next week I might not have as many videos because I have some other news that I will get into then. It depends. I'm probably going to have videos. It just might not be what you're expecting, and at some point in the next few weeks I'm going to have probably a week where I'm not going to have any videos being done, simply because I have a big life event happening soon and it's going to take up all my time. So yeah, I do apologize in advance for that, but yeah, and I apologize in advance that you basically got 2 videos of me ranting at you this week instead of just the one that I have been typically doing. But yeah, what are you going to do? I think it's kind of interesting stuff to talk about, and I wanted to talk about it and get your opinions on it as well, so what better way than to do a video about the topic, you know? Thanks for watching, you guys. Catch you later. Peace.